Hello, Michael. This is Victoria. I can't switch on my camera. I don't know why.
Victoria, hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great.
And I see you and hear you.
Oh, good.
But
thank you for telling me you see me.
I don't understand why. I've just finished another meeting and everything was okay with
okay, the American Center is holding off on other videos at the beginning of this while we have our initial presentation, if that's okay. I'm going to go ahead and start. And by the way, Victoria, it's so nice to hear your voice and to have you a part of this. This is wonderful. So Valentina, am I good to start? Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for our discussion about how the American media covers Russia. And today is the first of a 4-part series on the American media. In the coming weeks, we're going to be talking about how the American media covers racial issues, how the American media covers the rise of extremism, particularly in the small state of West Virginia. So we're going to be talking about some very difficult issues, but hopefully this will be a fun and interesting forum for everyone. My name is Michael Beckelhimer. I'm joining you today from Los Angeles. And I'm working with Valentina Vasilyeva, who's also on the call here. She's a Russian journalist, broadcast journalist from Moscow, and she's currently working in Washington, D.C. as a reporter for the Voice of America. So a few notes up front. This program is presented by the Washington-based Forum for Cultural Exchange in coordination with the American Center of Moscow and the US Embassy. And we're presenting the series in coordination with Victoria Zhuravlyova, who I was just speaking with, the head of the Russian American Academic Center for American Studies at the Russian State University for the Humanities in Moscow. And today we have students from the American Studies Department at RGGU and the Journalism Department. And we also have students joining us from the Moscow Pedagogical State University and the Moscow State University Department of Journalism. So the goal of this series is to bring Americans who are working in the United States media into conversation with Russian students and Russian journalists. And in every session, we will talk about the American media, but in the context of what's happening in the US. Because we want this to be interesting for those of you who are engaged in journalism, but also for those of you like me who are trying to figure out what's happening in this country. So we hope to go behind the headlines and really get a good sense of how the US media is covering events in the United States and sort of what that says about the institution of the media, the institution of the press, and the American public. So today's session will last 1 hour. A couple notes about your participation. For those of you who are participating on Zoom, those of you who logged in and are at RGGU, MGU, or the Pedagogical University, you'll be able to submit questions in the chat at any time. And halfway through, about 30 minutes in, we will open up the cameras so you can ask questions on camera if you prefer. I will try to answer or to note your questions as they come in. And also for those of you watching on the Facebook feed at the American Center, I will also be given some of your questions as well. So time permitting, I will be able to ask some of those questions as they come in. So a quick note about me, why am I here? I guess I would start by saying I'm a huge Russophile. I first visited the Soviet Union in the 1980s. I studied Russian at American University, and then I lived and worked and did other things in Moscow in the early 1990s. Went back to the United States and got my master's at Harvard in Russian. And I've been devoted to understanding Russia basically my entire life. I recently made a documentary film about Pushkin. When Americans ask me to talk about Russia, I find Pushkin is an interesting lens, how he became Russia's everything. So all of us on this call are very committed to Russian studies and the understanding of Russia. And I've always paid very close attention to what Americans think about Russia. And that's why I think today's topic is so interesting, because we're discussing how the American media portrays Russia, what the media says about Russia. And so that brings us to our guest, Gregory Pfeiffer. He is going to talk about the American media. He was a practicing professional in the American media. And by way of introduction, I would just like to say that of those few things that I said about myself, you can multiply those by 100, and that is Gregory Pfeiffer. He is a Russophile. He speaks perfect Russian. His American father met his Russian mother in Moscow in the 1950s. I'm going to let him tell that story. He went to Harvard. He became the Moscow correspondent for National Public Radio, which for those of us in the United States who consume news, National Public Radio is probably the single most reliable and respected source of news that we have. He's also contributed articles to all of the major publications, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Foreign Affairs, as well as others. And he's written several books. One of them is called Russians, The People Behind the Power. And I want to point out that he writes about the people because it's important that coverage of Russia isn't just focused on Putin, but it's focused on the country as a whole and the people who live in Russia. And I think that's what Greg is going to bring to this conversation. So he lives in Washington. He's the executive director of the Institute of Current Affairs. He's researching and writing a book about Boris Nemtsov. And with that, Greg, thank you for being here. So glad to see you. And can we start this conversation today with your story about how your parents met and how that influenced your future studies and career?
Yes, absolutely, Michael. Thank you very much for that very flattering introduction. And I'm also very glad to hear that you too are trying to figure out what's happening in this country. Actually, my parents' story is an interesting one. I heard snippets of it when I was growing up. My parents didn't really talk to me about it. And I only really fully understood it fairly recently when I did a piece for NPR about it a few years ago. So, as you said, like you, I studied Russian. I grew up speaking Russian thanks to my Russian mother and my American father, who was talented with languages, spoke Russian very well. They spoke Russian in the house. So my father was also went to Harvard, by the way. He was a graduate student later at Columbia University. In the 1950s, and he was studying Soviet law. And in 1959, he became one of the guides, the American guides for the American exhibition in Moscow. And this was one of the very few ways that students of Russian could get into the country. So he jumped on the chance. And as it happens, many of the other guides were also sort of top students of Soviet politics and law and Russian history. And so it was a really interesting group of people. A lot of them went on to do very incredible things. So my father's job during the exhibition was to lecture about the Ford Thunderbird, the sort of convertible car that looked really terrific. I still think it looks pretty cool. And so he was, this was set amid many different pavilions. There was one of a model American house, the site of the famous Khrushchev Nixon kitchen debate. There were exhibitions about art, about agriculture, all sorts of things. Anyway, so my dad's job was to lecture about the horsepower and the mileage and and everything to do with the Ford Thunderbird. But he got a lot of questions from the audience, and this was a big audience because people were interested in in this American car. But a lot of questions were about life in the U.S. And he really warmed to this. He really saw this as an opportunity to interact with Soviets, sure, in this official setting, but nevertheless, because there were so many people there, people felt freer to ask questions. There were some questions that were clearly planted by the KGB. Among them, why do you lynch blacks in the United States, which is a very good question. And he got a question about American jazz that he couldn't quite answer. He was a devotee of classical music, loved jazz, but couldn't answer it. And he said he followed the line of the microphone cable to the microphone, and he saw this in his description, this beautiful young woman. And he immediately, first thing he did before answering the question was to declare a péririf. The presentation was over, and he immediately gave her tickets to come back the next day. And these were among the hottest commodities in Moscow, tickets to get into the exhibition. I think there were 2 million people who visited it that summer. She happened to have a boyfriend. So he gave her a ticket for the boyfriend, and he kept inviting her until she came without the boyfriend. And that was my mother, and the rest is history. She said she was drawn to him because later in the story it came out, because he was speaking about life in the United States with a freedom that she didn't see in the Soviet Union. She said you could hear in his voice that these people were free and we were not. So that was the start of my parents' relationship. There were ups and downs. They eventually married and left to live in London in 1969. But doing the story, one of the things that really struck me was how the U.S. government and Americans really felt that public diplomacy was important. That events like this American exhibition, and this was a time of thaw in the Soviet Union when there were exhibitions from other countries during this time, and of course it was the Khrushchev era. It was a time of opening up before the Cuban Missile Crisis and other crises worsened relations quite sharply soon after. Nevertheless, there were Americans who were going to the Soviet Union. There were Americans who were interested in understanding the Soviet Union, talking to Soviets, and there was an interest from the other side. And it strikes me how little of that there is now, when ostensibly borders are open. There's the internet. Yes, there are increasing restrictions, and yet there's very little U.S. public diplomacy. So that was really, really striking to me, doing the story and learning about my own parents' history in the process.
Well, that's such a fascinating story, Greg. So let me ask you, your father was in Moscow trying to explain America to the Russians, and you then became a reporter reporting from Moscow, trying to explain Russia to the Americans. So tell us about how you ended up in Moscow, why you decided to become a reporter. You didn't go to journalism school. You fell into, I would like to hear about how you became a writer and a reporter, and then tell us a little bit about your time in Moscow as an American journalist.
Sure. Well, I followed in my father's footsteps. My dad was a very talented journalist. He was always a freelance writer. He never worked as a staff as a staff writer. He briefly worked for CBS. The legendary veteran broadcaster Marvin Kalb, who was the CBS correspondent in Moscow in the early '60s, hired my dad to work there. He hated having strict schedules and people telling him what to cover. So he ended up being a freelance writer his whole life. And he spent a lot of time in the Soviet Union. He actually fell in to the kind of writing that he did because he went to Moscow in 1961 as one of the first exchange students during that time. And he went to MGU. He spent an academic year at MGU researching Soviet law for his dissertation. And so he would go every day to the Lenin Library and do research. And he soon became more interested in what was going on around him than in the books. So he didn't finish his graduate degree. Instead, he became a journalist, and he wrote about Soviet life, about the people that he met, the friendships that he made, the paradoxes that he saw, and he was really one of the very few American journalists who did that. In fact, when I was first starting my career, when I went to Moscow after graduating from college, and I was trying to pitch the editors of American newspapers and magazines, a lot of them had been correspondents at one time or another in Moscow, because Moscow was one of the big assignments. And so a lot of the editors, when I was coming up, had been in Moscow. And they remembered my dad because he criticized the Western press for being superficial, for not digging into what makes life in Russia unique. And so I got a lot of rejections. One of the rejections I got was from the foreign editor of the Baltimore Sun. The Baltimore Sun had a bureau, had 2 correspondents in Moscow at the time. And he wrote back a long letter, a long email saying, your father used to criticize Western journalists when he was writing about Russia. I understand the response, because these were correspondents who had to go to press conferences, who had to write about the news, who were given directions from their editors, and my dad didn't have to deal with any of that. So I understand them as well. But he wrote back this letter and he said, well, now I'm going to teach you something, and I'm going to teach you how to write a newspaper article. This is what you put in the introduction, and this is what you put in as your thesis paragraph, and this is how you back it up. And I think the tone was pretty angry. He was, lecturing me, finally, getting back at sort of my dad's perceived slights. But I was overjoyed. It was one of the learning moments in my career. So I always thought I would do writing in one way or another. When I went to college, I thought that I would not study Russian, that I would really undertake a liberal arts education in the American tradition, take Japanese history, art history, all sorts of various courses, Western political philosophy, and really sort of try to decide what I wanted to do. But speaking Russian and being always sort of fascinated with life in Russia, especially at a time when the country was changing, the late '80s, early '90s, and young reporters were sort of streaming to Moscow and Russia and the former Soviet Union to cover the story. After I graduated from college, I went to go get my start, and that's how it began. I had sort of various jobs. I had a fellowship in Russia for a couple of years. I wrote for the Moscow Times and other publications. I ended up as a correspondent, as you said, for NPR. And one of the things that I really appreciated about my background was not only that I could sometimes pass for a Russian, because my Russian language was good enough, especially after a shot or two of vodka loosened my tongue. But also, having studied Russian in the same program as you at Harvard, I knew at least something about the history and the geography and the culture, and I read Russian literature, and I think that's vital for understanding a very complicated, very paradoxical, very important country. And unfortunately, I think a lot of reporters these days just don't have that background.
That's an interesting issue, I think, when writing about Russia. As a journalist, do you feel, or did you feel the need to explain to the American audience what Russia means and what explain the country, because it is so difficult to understand? I mean, any country could be difficult to understand, but did you feel this extra burden to try to convince people that the story was important?
I did indeed. And when I was a reporter for NPR, there were well, one of the things is that I was very lucky, and NPR indeed is a terrific outlet. I have a lot of criticism about the direction that it's heading. I think that it's too interested in entertaining its listeners. A completely understandable pressure. The editors and managers at NPR see themselves competing with other American broadcast media and American television, and so there was pressure really all the time not to cover politics, not to cover things that Americans would find dull, to do lighter stories, and that's all well and good. I wanted to do those stories too, and NPR does need to appeal to its audience, but the news is it's not entertainment. It's something very crucial for a healthy society, healthy democracy, healthy politics, to healthy foreign policy. And so Americans need to know what's going on in Russia. And I would say, they need to know what's going on broadly in the world. But Russia is one of the more important countries for obvious reasons. There's been a long rivalry. And so I felt that pressure all the time. Do shorter stories, do fun stuff. And so that was always pressure. I was very lucky to have a very good editor who not only understood where I was coming from, that there were some stories that were very important about politics, about history that I needed to do, and so he would go and not only agree that I should do these stories, but then he would go and lobby the shows to get these stories on the air. There was one time when I just showed up in Moscow for NPR, and there was a Moscow city elections, and I think it was in 2005, the end of 2005, and it was it was important because it was a bellwether of where the Kremlin was headed, where the Putin administration was headed, and what parties were running, and what was going to happen to them. And I felt that Americans needed to know. That's one of the very few stories that didn't get on air as a story. And my editor said, well, look, just break up your story, because I'd actually done the story, break it up into little pieces, and air it at the top of the hour news spot. So at the top of the hour, there's 5 minutes of, this is the breaking news around the world. And in fact, more people listen to those than they listen to, the main morning and evening news shows. So I did that. I broke up this story into about 5 pieces, and over 5 hours, I gave little snippets of it. But so my main motivation actually was to try to, sort of overarching one, was to try to explain to Americans why Russians are different. And this isn't a good or bad. Russians, I think, as a society, have different goals, and they have different motives, and there are lots of different reasons for it. It's a different country. It's bigger than America. Its geography is different. Its climate is different. Its history is different. Its culture is different. And so one of the more visible differences to me, for example, is the importance of the trope of the collective in Russian culture. Whereas in American culture, there's a lot more importance placed on individualism and pulling yourself up and doing things by yourself. Whereas in Russia, the individual is seen with greater skepticism, because Russia is a difficult place to survive. A lot of the land is not very easy to grow crops on, and it's also a difficult place to govern. And so the group is important, whether it's the family or the village, or the region, the individual is often seen as a threat to the survival of the collective. So I try to explain things like that to my audiences, and one of the things that really gratified me was when my friends who are scholars in the U.S. would send a note saying, great story, because that's what really I found that important, that over my posting, which I think was 4 years, I would do stories that over time, if people listen to NPR regularly, people would get a sense, a more global sense of what was going on in the country.
Yeah, Greg, I have to say, at that time when you were reporting from Moscow, I was working at an office in Los Angeles, sitting in traffic for hours every day, waiting for your reports from Moscow to come onto the radio. So that was, I think you did, it was a nice mix of political reporting, human interest reporting. There's so many different types of stories. But when you hear reporting about Russia in the press today, whether you're reading it or hearing it on the radio or on TV, what do you think the US media gets right about Russia, and what do they get wrong about Russia?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and it's a pretty sort of deep one when it comes to the American media in general, because that's changed a lot over the years, over the past couple of decades. As I was saying, this idea of reporting sort of concrete human stories that tell the big picture and big developments in understandable ways, with sort of human emotions that listeners can identify with. That was a sort of a creed of foreign correspondence when I was a foreign correspondent, that you do sort of little slices of life, and your loyal readers or listeners develop this sense of understanding over time. That's largely gone now. I don't see it. One of the reasons is that there are so few foreign correspondents now. CNN, which is one of the few broadcast media that have correspondents in Moscow, they don't do reporting anymore. Occasionally they will have a correspondent doing a two-way live interview about what Putin said today, or some other developments. And so this kind of reporting really doesn't exist in the broadcast media. It still does exist in print. But a lot of the print media, well, first of all, I should say there's also very few print correspondents. The New York Times has, I think, about 5 correspondents, and we're very lucky as a country to have an outlet that can have 5 correspondents in Moscow. But when I was posted in Moscow, I think something like 7 American bureaus shut down. An astounding number. We were having sort of goodbye parties regularly for departing correspondents. All these newspapers that were just shutting down their foreign bureaus, all over the world: the Boston Globe, the Baltimore Sun, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Chicago Tribune. It was really pretty tragic. And so instead of having sort of reporters trying to find original stories and different angles, it's come to sort of one story, and that story is U.S.-Russia relations, Putin, and well, for 4 years we had Russia-Trump. Part of the reason is that there is a lot that's going on, that and I think coverage tends to be superficial these days, not because it's anti-Russian. Every week there seem to be new revelations about attacks by the Kremlin, whether it's on American elections or our government agencies, or for example, an explosion in a Czech Republic arms depot in 2014, or assassinations or assassination attempts against people. So there are a lot of important stories to cover, but they dominate the coverage. And so this kind of reporting on society, on culture, on history, doesn't really exist. I don't see it anymore. It's occasionally when you see something other than sort of the main news, it's a correspondent doing a trip in across Yakutia or some sort of exotic place. And so that's I think that's really terrible. Part of it is that reporters reflect society, and I think American society just is not interested in foreign affairs, foreign cultures, not interested in what's going on in Russia. I think part of it also is the result of the Kremlin's successful isolating of Russia. It's difficult for foreigners now to travel to Russia. There's a measure of fear. There's suspicion. And I think that the sort of repression at home has really worked to isolate the country. Now, of course, there are reasons, I think, for that. I think Putin needs to keep Russian society to some degree isolated because he derives legitimacy from confronting the West and spreading propaganda about the West. That's not to say that the West doesn't have its own misconceptions. But I think that another major influence also is just I apologize for being very vague, but I think it reflects an American trait in general that Americans tend to be optimistic about progress. We're eternal optimists, and we view the world through really sort of very thick lenses that make us feel that the rest of the world likes us and wants to be like us. I remember when I was traveling back and forth from Moscow to New York and Washington for many years, I would get questions about, well, why is the economy in such bad shape? Why are antagonisms growing? The Russians have the internet now. Surely they want to be just like us. And this was no joke. Americans genuinely feel that. So I think that I think that's also part of it. It reflects our culture, and that's unfortunate because our lack of knowledge is it's not good for our society. It's not good for our democracy. It's not good for our foreign policy. And I think this non-understanding of Russian society, Russian culture, Russian history is also partly to blame for poor foreign policy. I'm not, I think what happened under Trump is fairly obvious, but I think that was also part of the reason why I think the Obama foreign policy failed in Russia.
So, Greg, you mentioned you don't think the press is anti-Russian, and I want to press you, no pun intended, on that for 1 second. I don't want to spend more time talking about Trump. I think everybody around the world is probably tired of that topic. But one of the things that I noticed, and many people noticed in the last 4 years, was how the mainstream media or the left-leaning media really became anti-Russian, I would say. And that not only do we not have reporters like you on the news every night who understand Russia, who have history in Russia, who can bring that broader context, but we have immediate, sudden experts about Russia who are on the news, on TV every night, talking about how Trump is a puppet of Putin. And nobody was saying, all right, definitely the Kremlin was involved in the elections. Definitely we have proof that there was interference, or there's a historical context of both countries interfering in each other's affairs. But really, is Trump a puppet of Putin? So that kind of objective, fact-based reporting, to me, seemed to go out the window. And the press became very focused on how Russia is hurting America. And I think that is an unfortunate turn of events. And so can you speak a little bit more about that, about our evening news broadcast and how it's so anti-Russian, I think?
Yeah, I mean, that's a terrific question. I would take issue with, while absolutely taking your point, I would take issue with anti-Russian because I think people are talking about, that there are, people on air who are experts in disinformation, or who are experts in, cyber hacking, or who are, former foreign policy State Department officials. And so they're talking about their specific area of expertise, and they've been brought on to talk about that. But you're absolutely right that's the impression, at least to me, that it gives, because so much of the news, especially television news, is just talking heads, and part of the reason is structural. Cable news is 24 hours. These editors have to fill those hours. They've got 9 people sitting at a desk. They've got to talk about something. They're going to talk about well, when it was under Trump. Now I think they're having a little bit of difficulty without Trump, readjusting. But under Trump, it was 24 hours talking about Trump, because that was the main issue. That was the main threat to our society and to our politics. And so it was partly understandable. But absolutely, there's no substitute for reporting on the ground. When you have people just giving their opinions, excuse me. And one of the problems that I think in the American media is that for a long time, objective coverage was seen as put a Democrat behind the table, put a Republican, let them give their views, and that's objective coverage. And I think that's an utter abdication of the role of journalism. The role of journalism is, yes, to present these different views, but to provide the context, the crucial context. And a lot of that context comes from on the ground reporting. So, for example, when I was in Russia and I would cover, for example, the war in Chechnya. Excuse me, please. I'm just going to take a drink of water. In Chechnya, what was important to me was not only what was going on the ground, but the history. What is the history of the relations of Moscow's center versus its periphery in the Caucasus? What are the motivations? What are the driving emotions for Chechens? What are the emotions for Russian society, and what's behind that? And there are so many nuances that you can only get from the being on the ground. I remember when a story that I was covering in excuse me, it was actually in South Ossetia during the Russia-Georgia war. And at one point, the Russian military had announced, or the Kremlin had announced, that it was pulling out its troops. And so I and a bunch of other reporters were contacted by the Russian military, said, we can take you to the sort of a staging site where the troops were being pulled out. So a bunch of us sort of climbed into the back of this truck, military truck, and we were driven. This is in sort of Georgia proper. We were driven out of South Ossetia, and we were driven to a field. We got out and walked up to the top of the hill. And it was in August. It was sort of beautiful weather, hot, sort of beautiful landscape. And on the top were, I think, 3 personnel carriers, armored personnel carriers, a tank, and a couple of trucks. Now, this was supposed to represent the Russian forces pulling out. And I happened to be doing a live two-way interview. It just happened to be at the time when the show, I think it was All Things Considered, the afternoon show was on air. And so I started sort of having an interview with the host on air, and all of a sudden an officer came up and said, "Okay, all you reporters back into the truck. You've got to go." This is right as the tank and a couple of trucks started moving, and I was trying to describe it. And so on air, I thought, this is terrible. I'm not going to be able to do my story. And on air, I start telling the officer in Russian, "Пожалуйста, я сейчас в эфире. Дайте мне, пожалуйста, закончить мой сюжет." And he said, "No, but get on the back of the truck." And I thought, oh, this is so terrible. It's ruined the interview. And half an hour later, I got a call. The show was over. Half an hour later, I got a call from the producer saying, "That was great. That was the best thing we had in the past 6 months," because it was this live sort of interaction, and it sort of gave a feeling for what was going on the ground. And there's really nothing that can replace that. I was just actually listening to a book talk by Marvin Kalb, whom I mentioned, who was the CBS correspondent in in Moscow in the 1960s, and he told kind of a similar story, that he and some reporters were also driven out of Moscow for a demonstration that the Red Army was against military conflict and against arms, and so they were driven to a field, and there were about, I don't know, 10 soldiers, and they demonstrably threw down their rifles in front of the camera, and the officer says, "See, the Soviet Union is against armed conflict." Now, Marvin Kalb, his big problem back then, when there was a lot of news being reported, was the Soviet censors, and so he had to describe what was going on in a way that wouldn't be censored. So he started his report by saying, earlier this afternoon, a number of American correspondents were taken for a ride outside of Moscow. Now, to be taken for a ride means, you're being tricked. And so just with that phrase, he managed to, get the idea. And then he described what happened, but the listening audience, the viewing audience knew that. So I didn't have censorship to contend with. But there were lucky things that happened when you were reporting in the field that gave a sense of what was going on, and nothing can replace that.
Right. Well, what you just described was something that the broadcasters love. So it was just a week or two ago when a CNN reporter was shown being thrown into a truck during a Navalny protest, and that was great. It's like, oh my gosh, they've got a CNN reporter. I think we should open it up to questions now. So Robert, if you could turn the cameras on. So everyone knows this session is being recorded today. If you don't want to go on camera, you can turn your camera off. But we'll continue talking, and if you have a question, raise your hand, and we'll let you ask it of Greg. So Greg, let's talk about Russia today. Important stories coming out of Russia. It seemed like one story for 4 years under Trump, and now things feel a little more normal here. There's a lot of movement, I think, in different opportunities to improve relations with Russia or fix relations with Russia, or perhaps make relations worse. This is something I think the Biden administration is making more efforts to reach Russia in these different areas. What do you think are the important stories that the American media should be covering, and how should they cover it?
Sure. Well, I think because there's so little reporting about Russia and from every other country in the world, that when it comes to reporting the big stories that are the ones that are going to dominate the news, that they should be done right, so that it's not just a sort of a stereotype of Russians, or a stereotype of Putin as somebody who hates the West, which as you mentioned is often the result of superficial coverage. Even though I don't think that's necessarily the aim of reporters, or the aim of editors, or the aim of media outlet managers. And so, if there are going to be stories about, what Putin is thinking, and what might he be planning, they should really include, well, what are his real motivations? What's going on in Russian politics? Who are some of the players? Who are the backers of Putin? Who are the commentators? Who are the opinion makers? And there used to be that, reporters used to talk to opinion makers, like, for example, Sergei Markov, who used to be more of an opinion maker, maybe in his day than he is now. And that just doesn't take place. So it's, I think there needs to be more about the nuances of Russian politics, instead of just Putin's confrontation with the West, and his confrontation with the opposition. Those are important stories. They should be covered. But I think that there has to be more nuance, so that when it comes to our understanding and our policy making, there has to be those nuances have to be reflected. Why is Putin popular? Why are his approval ratings tend to be still around 60%? I know there are different kinds of different approval ratings about different things, but generally 50%, 60% approval ratings. Why? What's important to Russians? What's important to, for example, when I was in Russia, I would go out and do stories about life in the regions. Villages dying out because there are not enough people to go into industry there, or regional administrations mismanaged, or regional administrators who are trying to do something. What are their obstacles? So I would say that's key. I think also important would be, I think, and really sort of crucial to do, but I'm not very optimistic that we'll see these stories, is just, what are Russians think? What are they reading? What culture is a great way, as Michael, more better than I. Culture is a terrific way into a society. What movies are playing in the movie theater? What plays? I was lucky that I had that freedom, and I would do as many stories as I could. It wasn't that many about the Russian theater, which remained vibrant since the Soviet collapse, and told you a lot about what Russians were watching, what they felt important. So that's where I would start.
Yeah, well, and this is one of the problems I have with this, with the talking heads on the news who have this drumbeat of everything's about Putin. Putin's in control of everything, and every story in Russia is somehow connected to Putin. So it makes me concerned that the American public isn't interested in hearing about what Russians are watching at the cinema, or what books they're reading, or where they're traveling. And another interesting thing, in Russia, there's, Moscow is so central to the life of the country, but it's a huge country. And I think it's interesting that the American press still seems to report about Russia through the Kremlin, So there are all these stories happening around the regions that may or may not be connected to what's happening in Moscow. But getting outside of that Moscow lens, I think would be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, if I may just very quickly add, absolutely. And there's just there aren't the people to do it. There used to be many more correspondents. There used to be much more space, and it's just, these are sort of structural problems, and they reflect just a wider problem in the American media, also in the publishing industry. And I think at the heart of it, it reflects American society and a disinterest in complicated stories. Look, I am now, as you mentioned, I'm writing a book about Boris Nemtsov. But it took me a long time to convince my agent that this was an important story to do, that this was an important figure in Russian politics, that he was first deputy prime minister, then he was an opposition leader, that his life coincided with post-Soviet Russian history, and it was a way to tell what's happened since the Soviet collapse, and that he was an interesting character. He had an interesting, shall we say, private life, and somebody who's good, who creates a good narrative to grip readers. Well, my agents sort of poo-pooed that for more than a year. He said, you really should write about Trump and Russia. And I'm not really qualified to write about Trump. I'm not an investigative reporter. I'm not I live in Washington, but I'm interested in Russia and other countries and foreign policy. I don't cover domestic politics. And so I had to spend a lot of time, convincing him that I didn't, want to write a story. I started writing. I wasted a couple months on a book proposal, but that was it. Nobody wanted to read any proposal unless it had something to do with Trump and Russia.
Yeah, it's tricky. I like to joke that I live in Hollywood and I made a film about Pushkin, a dead Russian poet that nobody here even knows about, and so the audience here did not understand what I was doing. But it's hard to connect with American audiences if it's not something very, very tightly defined and very in the moment of politics. A couple questions have come in. One, I think, is a quick question. How popular is RT in the US? Isn't it perceived as biased? Do you watch RT?
quick answer. I'm not the best person to answer that. I don't watch RT. I think it's a propaganda channel. I don't know how many Americans watch it. I would say probably more than should.
Probably more than should. I will say that, thinking about the American media landscape and trying to get different sources, different viewpoints, I have found there are some respected professors and journalists who will occasionally write for RT just to present a somewhat different view that's still, I think, relatively mainstream and not completely propaganda. So I think that as an outlet for American journalists who have a slightly unpopular view of Russia, it can be informative. But I don't know very many people who watch it or use it as a source. Do you think, on the whole, there is interest in Russian society and in Russian culture, not politics, in America now?
That's a very good question. Let me just say about RT. Sure, absolutely. People. I don't doubt that there are good people on it. But the overriding motive, raison d'être of the channel is to broadcast propaganda. So even those people, I find, are there for a reason, to sort of confuse the audience. That's another topic. I think that Americans, there's a lot that Americans and Russians share. I think there's a lot in common in the character. They're big countries with sort of that see a lot of their territory still as a frontier. There's the American West in Russia. There's the Caucasus. There's Siberia. Americans and Russians tend to be less formal than Europeans. Society tends to be less hierarchical. I think there's a natural understanding that a human understanding that when Russians and Americans sort of get together, there's a lot that unites them. And I think that yes, Americans remember that the Soviet Union was our sort of the main enemy, during the Cold War, and there's a fascination with that. And so I think there is a sort of a latent interest, but I don't see it reflected now. It's just I think that, the media is partly to blame that it peddles in stereotypes. So I think that there's a lack of understanding. There's a lack of public diplomacy, and I think Americans would be interested if they have more access.
Agreed. Yes, and I think that there is an interest in Russian culture. I mean, that's a wonderful way to connect with people through Americans' love of Russian culture, Russian literature. But there's not enough connection. I'd like to know your personal opinion. One note, so Timothy, I saw that you raised your hand, but I'm not able to get to that. Do you hear what, Timothy, there you are. All right, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, I do. So first of all, thank you for this presentation. And my question was that a couple of years ago, CNBC, I think, CNBC made it made a report on Yandex. Yandex is it's Russian Google. Problem is, this material was it was awful because it pointed out that Google is struggling in Russia, which it is, and not at all. Well, how often do how often those reports, those materials get not this trait, not this how do you say it, неправильные,
so they're incorrect.
Not correct, incorrect, without without basis. How often does that happen?
I suspect a lot. I'm not surprised to to hear you say that. And as I was saying earlier, when I got something wrong, and I I got stuff wrong, plenty of times. If only I remember I was reporting about the atomic, the nuclear energy industry, and I said something about a nuclear energy plant. I think it was in Karelia, and I said it was 15 miles from the border. And somebody irate wrote in saying, it's 30 miles from the border. Don't you correspondents, don't get anything right. Okay, maybe a sort of a superficial complaint might seem, but no, I mean, reporters have a duty to get things right. And so it pains me deeply whenever I hear anything like that. I think it probably happens a lot. And I think it also reflects just, the state of the American media in general. Because there are fewer correspondents who are out on the ground, doing research, because there's less competition, and you really have to get it right. If you make a mistake, you discredit yourself. Because there's less interest in it. I think this kind of thing happens all the time, and the result is a superficial understanding that's can help generate for lack of communication, mistakes. It's and at the end of the day, I think that's dangerous when we don't have a source that's or we don't have sources that are reliable for the voting public to be able to make up its own opinion about what's going on in Russia, what's going on in other parts of the world, and then vote for political leaders whom they like and whom they want in office because they think these people are going to have good policies. Yeah, it's dangerous. I suspect there's going to be more of that because I see the industry is continuing to deteriorate. I mentioned the publishing industry. It's very difficult now to pitch something to a publishing house that's the editor doesn't think has a chance of becoming a bestseller. If they don't think that they can make a lot of money selling it, then they're just not interested in it. And so a lot of important subjects, a lot of interesting topics just aren't considered. So I'm sorry to hear that, but I fear that those kinds of things will continue.
What about fake news? So we do have a question about that. And what is your perspective on fake news in the United States now? And also thinking about your experience in Russia in the past, where I would say there was more fake news. It was perhaps more a part of the overall ecosystem of news. And now that seems to be an important, a big part of American news as well.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Well, I think fake news and disinformation is really terrible. And I'm dismayed, frankly, at the propaganda machine in Russia that the Kremlin has increasingly backed. I first really saw it in 2008 when I was reporting the Russia-Georgia war, and it really struck me that all of a sudden there were stories in the Russian media about Georgian agents, coming in and trying to stage explosions and kidnap Russians, and they were all fake, and that was really dismaying, and it was shocking because in the 1990s the Russian media was really just vibrant and open, and it was a joy for sort of jaded Americans like me to see, because I didn't see that kind of excitement and energy in the American press. And also it struck me that Russian reporters tended to be very young, that you could get jobs in journalism, after graduating from journalism school. And so it was really tragic for me to see that. Back then, when I first saw it, about 10 years ago, a little bit more, it was aimed at the Russian population. Now it's a global industry that seeks to undermine elections in this country, in European countries, and it's effective. When elections come down to, in this country, in our very deeply flawed democracy, when they come down to, a few 100,000 votes or tens of thousands of votes, or even thousands of votes in key districts, what people are reading and seeing on social media can play a key role. So I think it's very, very dangerous, because it seeks to deepen the hatreds and the divisions in society, and to foment violence. I mean, we know of stories where there were protests in the US and counter protests, and Russian trolls, unfortunately, were whipping up emotions on both sides. So I think fake news, disinformation is ultimately one of the key challenges for liberal democracies to address. And how to regulate this kind of disinformation that infects their own societies and undermines the democratic process and encourages extremism.
Great. We are at time. I'm going to ask one more question, but I do want to note for the audience that I've posted a survey link in the chat, and we would love it if you could fill out this anonymous survey to give us feedback on this event. But Greg, I would like to end on one loaded question. And recently you did you interviewed Vladimir Karamurza on your podcast about the opposition movement in Russia. And one of the observations you made, which is an observation I think we're all making, is this tightening of the tightening of the reins on the press, and the trying to reining in of the freedoms with what's presented. And we have a question here in the chat about media relations between the US and Russia. So when we think about the Russian media, who is being more restricted, and the American media, who might be not as connected to Russia, have fewer resources available, what are the opportunities for more media cooperation and support between Russian and American media?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think there needs to be more, first of all, more American public diplomacy aimed at connecting to Russians, just the type of thing that we're doing now with this talk. I think person to person contact and sharing of views and healthy debate. Everybody has different points of view. Everybody has different sides of the story. That's natural. What's important is that both of our societies are able to have a dialogue, and there are very few opportunities for that. So I think that's just a broader issue, in general, to do with our society and our politics. When it comes to the media, I don't see any substitute to sending more correspondents to Russia, to have the people on the ground to cover stories that need to be covered, and not just any people, but people with an understanding of Russia, with an understanding of the language, who read Russian literature, who are able to explain differences, not in a stereotypical way, but to try to sort of get inside the heads of the people that they are interviewing, the people they're trying to describe. And unfortunately, I have to be pessimistic. I see the situation in the U.S. media deteriorating. If the problem with the Russian press is government censorship, government repression, here in the States, it's it's capitalism, it's commercialism, it's this need to compete, and it really started, I think, in the late 70s and 80s, when the main network TV news channels, ABC, CBS, and NBC, that all had bureaus and correspondents in Russia and in many other countries, when these companies and I should say that the news channels always lost money on the news. The news never generated money, but the channels saw the news as something that important to do for society. It was a point of pride. And so when these networks were bought by GE, by Disney, by big corporations that saw the news as a profit-making operation, and so news began to be about, well, how do you program your DVD player? You know, more Americans found that interesting than you know, hearing news from around the world. That was the beginning of the situation, you know, that we're in. And as I was saying earlier, it you know, it has to do with these pressures to, you know, to entertain listeners. And I often got questions about, well, why are you always reporting bad news in Russia? You know, why don't you do a good story? You know, and I tried to do as many positive, you know, positive stories as I could, but I never saw the news as good or bad. I would do stories about things that I saw around me, going on. You know, and so I think there has to be more of that kind of attitude, that we report the news because it's important. And unfortunately, I have no reason to feel optimistic about that.
Okay, well, on that happy note, I want to say thank you to everyone. Greg, this was really fascinating. Just hearing your insights. You know, it makes such a difference when the people doing the reporting understand where they're reporting from. And I think you've brought so much good reporting to us, and I'm looking forward to your next book on Boris Nemtsov. So thank you again for being here. For all the participants, please fill out the survey that's in the chat, and look for following sessions. We have another session coming up about how Black journalists in America cover Black Lives Matter and issues of racial justice. And we have a journalism professor from the state of West Virginia who's going to talk to us about covering white nationalism and right-wing extremism in this small state. So stay tuned for those and check back, and thanks again. Signing off.
Thank you very much to everybody. My pleasure.
Greg, thank you.